so the fact that Larry Summers is now the most influential economist in Washington, to me, is very, very troubling. Obama really won this election promising to take on the ideology of deregulation, giving more and more to the people at the top and waiting for it to trickle down to the bottom. You know, I always remember that Sarah Palin and John McCain were ahead of Obama after the Republican convention. They got their bump. The Democratic convention had been actually pretty disappointed. They barely got a bump out of it. We were all looking pretty seriously at a future of a McCain-Palin ticket winning, and then Lehman collapsed. There was a 2-week period from when Sarah Palin was introduced to the world on August 30th to when Lehman collapsed on September 14th. And after Lehman collapsed, Obama found his voice, and he started talking about how this financial crisis was not the result of just one or two bad apples, but was the result of an ideology of deregulation that had gripped the United States for 8 years. And that's where he wasn't telling the truth, because it wasn't just the Bush years. And I think a lot of Democrats, and talking a little bit about maybe what gives me a little bit of a difference, because a different perspective, because I don't live in the U.S. I'm much less partisan. I'm not driven by a desire for Democrats to win elections. That's not what drives my writing. And I saw just an incredible amount of intellectual dishonesty from liberals and progressives during that election campaign, where we knew damn well that the key pieces of legislation that created the context for the economic crisis had been enacted during the Clinton years. But we knew that this was a better political message to claim that the ideology was Bush policy, was just the last 8 years. The problem with intellectual dishonesty is that it comes back to bite you, because if you are lying to yourselves and everyone else during the election campaign, then what's to prevent a Larry Summers from coming back and being given the keys to the Treasury once again? What grade would you give media in this country on this very issue? What grade? Well, I guess I would say much improved, but a little late, because I think that the problem with the U.S. economy is that it's been in this cycle of bubbles and busts, and during the bubbles, during the boom times, the media in this country has been an active participant in building that hype. I mean, bubbles are all about hype, right? And this is where I think that holding the media accountable is absolutely crucial. Jon Stewart was criticized for going after, Jim Cramer. Why pick on him? But of course pick on him, because bubbles are inflated with hot air, right? So who's filling the hot air but the press? I mean, this is the job of hype, and somebody like Jim Cramer was a hot air machine. So it's particularly relevant in analyzing the politics of how you create a bubble to hold the media accountable. Now, in retrospect, there's been some absolutely incredible investigative reporting by the business press.
Name something.
Well,
somebody.
Well, the New York Times investigative team has been absolutely incredible. Why am I forgetting her name? Gretchen Morgenstein. I mean, she has done I think some of the best reporting, and the piece that I think really changed history was her finding out about the battle over the regulating derivatives and introducing us to Brooksley Born, who was the whistleblower in the 90s, and making the argument for why we had to regulate this industry, and the pushback that she got from Rubin and Summers and Greenspan. That kind of, but it's retroactive. We needed that reporting at the time. This is it's kind of forensic reporting. But I do think now there's some really good work being done in investigating the bailout. I think Huffington Post is doing some really great stuff. Sam Stein is doing terrific research on lobbyists. One of the things I think is really important that's going on now is there's an outing of lobbyists. That lobbyists love to work in the dark and to remain anonymous, and that is something I think now that we know that the banks are lobbying against much-needed reforms using taxpayer dollars, it's really made them fair game, and the lobbyists are being dragged out of the shadows. We saw protests outside the American Bankers Association meeting in Chicago. I think that's really important because these are major power players that really enjoy not facing scrutiny. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce is also facing some really unwanted scrutiny. And to be honest, this is one of the reasons why I wanted to re-release No Logo, on this anniversary. It's not just because it happens to be 10 years. It's because, the mood is a bit of a No Logo moment. I mean, it is that sort of same anger at the takeover of public space and public institutions that I was tracking in the book, is back, really with a vengeance. And this seemed like the timing was right.
The other book, and you mentioned the shock doctrine.
Mm-hmm.
What year did this come out?
It came out in 2007.
Just 2 years ago?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Give us a capsule. What does this do? And I know you started off in the book talking to a woman that had severe mental problems.
Well, yeah.
For a reason. I mean, you might just tell that story as a kind of a metaphor for the book.
Well, the book the book is about different kinds of shock. That's why it's called the shock doctrine. But it's about the political uses of shock. And it came out of reporting I did in Iraq for Harper's Magazine in 2004. I did a piece for Harper's called Baghdad Year Zero, Pillaging Iraq in Pursuit of a Neocon Utopia. And that piece was looking at how the shock and awe attack on Iraq was deliberately exploited by the Bush team that came in the aftermath of the invasion, the civilian team, the CPA, to push through what economists call economic shock therapy, which is rapid-fire transformation, push to a free market system. We know it from the Russian context, the transformation very, very quickly from a closed communist market to overnight sort of a free market in the case of Russia, and a sort of oligarchic, arguably mafia capitalism. Joseph Stiglitz said that what Paul Bremer tried to do in the immediate aftermath of the shock and awe invasion was an even more extreme version of shock therapy than was practiced in the former Soviet Union. And then I happened to be in Iraq also when the first torture scandals broke, when the Abu Ghraib scandal broke. And I was trying to, and I ended the Harper's piece with this, trying to understand what these different forms of shock meant. The shock and awe attack followed by the economic shock therapy, and now suddenly these non-metaphorical shocks being in the news, the shocks on bodies, the use of torture. So I started reading the declassified CIA manuals about how to interrogate what they call resistant sources, people that don't want to talk to you. And the manuals talk all about the need to put a prisoner into a state of shock, that when the prisoner goes into a state of shock, when they're totally disoriented, then they become pliant. They regress. They go into a childlike state, and they're much more likely to cooperate with their interrogator. And when I read that, I thought that in some way it was a description of what I had witnessed in Iraq, that the idea was that the strategy, the war strategy, was that Iraq would be, and this is a quote actually in the book from Richard Armitage, Colin Powell's Undersecretary of State. He said the idea was that Iraqis would be so shocked and so awed that they would be easily marshaled from point A to point B. And point B, in the vision of the Bush administration, as executed by Paul Bremer, was that Iraq would be this perfect free market model economy. And if we cast our minds back to 2003, remember the first summer of Iraq under U.S. occupation, it was all about the economic reforms. Paul Bremer was passing laws, there seemed to be a new one every day, that allowed foreign investors to come in, own 100% of Iraq's assets. He announced the privatization of 200 of Iraq's state-owned companies. Iraq actually became, Donald Rumsfeld said it had some of the most enlightened tax policies in the world. Now, this was all done shock therapy style. There was no Iraqi government. They didn't have to negotiate. They did it very quickly. So I thought that I was seeing, in a sense, that they did on a mass scale what happens to individuals in the interrogation chamber, that they're put into a state of shock and then they're bent to the will of their interrogator. And here this was a country that was put into a state of shock, and they attempted to bend it to the will of their occupiers, and it didn't work. It backfired. So that's why I start the book with the story of a woman who underwent extreme electroshock treatment as part of these horrible CIA experiments in the 1950s as part of the MK Ultra program.
Do you and your family, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I just ask it this way, you can react to it, ever sit around and say, the Americans are getting what they deserve?
Well, we never talk that way because my parents consider themselves American as well as Canadian. They are. They do maintain their dual citizenship. They vote and all that. So they would, they wouldn't say that.
But do Canadians that you talk to feel this way?
No, I don't. Do you mean in terms of the financial crisis?
Well, as they look down on this country and the Iraq War and all the things that you talk about, what's their attitude?
I think there's so much goodwill in the world about this country, and if you look at how much people want to believe in American redemption, look at the excitement around the world